if we were dredging the channels in the Delta like we did up until the 1970s, we would quadruple the water volume in the Delta. And the benefits of that are astonishing.
Edward is the Director of Water and Energy Policy at the California Policy Center, and he is also the author of a book, The Abundance of Choice: Our Fight for More Water in California.
Ed Ring, welcome to State of Gold.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to be with you. With the new Capitol, what do we call it? Not the Annex building. That's where the legislature is now. What are we calling Capitol Annex, right?
I think it is the Capitol Annex.
There's the Annex where all the legislators in Newsom are working now, and then there's the Capitol Annex, which is allegedly a $1 billion plus project. So we're happy to have that as our background today. Ed, you're known as one of the top policy guys around, and you're putting out very insightful content. What is animating you most right now from a policy perspective about California?
Dredging.
One word, dredging, huh? Explain dredging.
It's something that we're not talking about enough. It has a relevance just for that reason alone. I think that the benefits of dredging, however, are so big that even if it was something that was being talked about by everyone, we should talk about it even more. Because if we were dredging the channels in the Delta like we did up until the 1970s, we would quadruple the water volume in the Delta. And the benefits of that are astonishing. There's so many. First of all, you'd have more capacity to move floodwater through the Delta. So you could fill the reservoirs higher. You wouldn't have to reserve space in the reservoirs for spring snowmelt, for example. You would have a higher capacity to move water through the Delta, which means we could save another 1 million acre feet of water that could be saved and yielded from California's reservoirs every year. You would also, however, because you have such a high water volume, such an increase in total water volume, you could turn up the Delta pumps a lot more, and you could transport a lot of water south to farms and cities in Southern California, because what would happen is the current that's altered when the pumps go on would be much harder to alter, because the water volume in the Delta would be so much greater. It would be harder to change the direction of the flow of the Delta. So you wouldn't pull in salinity nearly as easily. So you could run the Delta pumps more. And then the other thing, which is really astonishing if you think about it, it's counterintuitive, but if you have deep channels in the Delta, that's what the salmon prefer. They prefer being in the 12 feet deep. But what they've got right now, because they've all silted up, is water that's 2 to 3 feet deep. And so what we have are predatory bass that love warm, shallow water that eat all the salmon. People go, well, the bass were introduced back in the 1860s, 1870s, and the salmon didn't start really disappearing until the 1970s, 1980s. And the reason for that, because we correctly point out bass as one of the biggest problems with salmon. There's not enough limits on bass fishing, and they eat all of our salmon. But if the salmon could swim at a deep depth, which is what they were able to do, even after we channelized the Delta in the 1800s, we were dredging, and the farmers were doing it with their own equipment adjacent to their fields in the Delta. And so this was something that was stopped by environmentalists, and as a result, the volume and the depth of water in the Delta is way too shallow, not nearly enough. And so the idea of dredging in the Delta is a very inexpensive solution to a lot of problems that confront us with water and with habitat.
So dredge, baby, dredge.
Yeah.
So this ties to the 70s. The Beatles were still together.
Well, up till 71.
Early 70s. And the environmental movement in California began to pick up. And what you're saying is the environmental movement blocked our ability to dredge.
Yes.
And that has persisted all the way through 50-something years to now.
Pretty much. I mean, we dredge a couple of ship channels, and with great effort, it's possible to do selective dredging elsewhere. But it's not something that any private farmer, with rare exceptions, has the resources to do anymore, because the permitting process takes longer, costs more than the actual work itself. And that's true with a lot of things in California, of course.
So why else do we have a water problem and water shortage in the state of California?
Well, the biggest reason that we have a water problem is mismanagement. And the approach that we're taking is rationing, which is that the problem with some of the legislation, they call it conservation as a way of life. That's the tagline for recent legislation that imposes additional rationing on urban water consumers. And the problem with that is we've done a really good job of conserving water already. We went through the entire Los Angeles County, for example, and put in low flow toilets and saved 500,000 acre-feet of water a year by doing that. What we've got in California in the 1980s was 25 million people in the state consuming about 8 million acre-feet of water per year. Now we're 40 million people, nearly, here in California, and our urban water consumption is still 8 million acre-feet a year. It went up to 9 million in the 90s, and then even as population continued to increase, conservation measures brought that back down to 8 million acre-feet a year. And the point is, we're at diminishing returns with water rationing. They want to spend, with this latest bill, I think it's Senate Bill 1157, they intend to limit urban water to 42 gallons per person per day, indoor water consumption. And they're going to estimate about 400,000 acre-feet of savings at a cost of $7 billion to implement, and all kinds of annoyances, associated with this, and quality of life, and just being harassed. You'll have to have a water agency bureaucrat come to your property and negotiate how much outdoor water you're going to be permitted to use. If you get another resident in your house or a house guest, you have to, apply to get a higher limit. Now, to be fair, they're going to let the water agencies manage this however they wish, but you can rest assured there are water agencies that are going to come right down onto the individual property owners. And so you have to ask yourself, well, is 400 acre-feet a year of additional conservation worth it when we're using 8 million acre-feet for urban areas, 30 to 35 million acre-feet a year for our farms? And then environmental diversions, where we reserve the water, we keep it behind reservoirs, and we let it out to help maintain ecosystems, is itself, depending on whether it's a wet year or a dry year, between 30 and 60 million acre-feet a year. So 400,000 acre-feet over that denominator, it's less than 1%. And that's simply not worth it. There's so many other ways to create additional water supplies if you wanted to spend that $7 billion elsewhere.
Now, how would you invest that $7 billion more effectively?
Dredging. I mean, the best return on investment are probably dredging. Another one would be what is referred to as fish-friendly delta diversions. There's ways to get water out of the delta during flood months that won't harm the ecosystems. And this is something that's sort of getting put in second place behind the Delta Tunnel. And you have to be really careful when you talk about the Delta Tunnel. This is this 40-foot internal diameter, 45-mile-long tunnel that's going to start north of the Delta, and it's going to pull water out of the Sacramento River and dump it into the Clifton Court forebay to get where the pumps are, to get pumped south on the aqueducts. That's estimated to cost officially $20 billion. Now, we know from our experience with high-speed rail, it's probably going to be more like $40 or $50 billion. We also know that by the time they get through all the lawsuits and permits, it's not going to happen in our lifetimes. It might happen in our children's lifetimes. And the yield from that thing is estimated, and these are official numbers, 500,000 acre-feet a year. That's really not very much. And then when you take that 500,000 acre-feet a year and consider that environmentalist lawsuits are going to probably compel throttling down of the existing delta pumps to the extent they're getting the water through the tunnel, because they don't want to take any water with those pumps. It's not a very good return on investment. But down in Southern California, they see it as the only one that's, could possibly survive environmentalist challenges. So they're not willing to let go of the concept. North of the Delta, if you say something favorable about the tunnel, you better get to your car quick and drive away fast, because they're militantly against it. But there are other ways to do it, which I was just describing, fish-friendly delta diversions, where there's this design that's already being tested. They have pilot projects, and this exists elsewhere in the world, where they will allocate, you could take a delta island, you would cut an interior channel with a levee parallel to an outer levee, and you would create a channel that water could pass through during flood events. You line it with rocks and put perforated pipes inside, like giant French drains. And they estimate that a 200-acre site could withdraw 15,000 acre feet a day, which if you ran it for 100 days, that's 1.5 million acre feet. And at a cost, including the aqueducts to connect it to the whole distribution system in the state, $2 to $3 billion. And you could get millions of acre feet out of one of those sites. You could build a couple of those sites. And that's what they call the big gulp. And we are not able to take that big gulp during flood events. And that's where millions of acre feet are being squandered.
So is the simple headline as to why we're not doing these more cost-effective, practical strategies that misplaced environmentalism is blocking these strategies, or is something else blocking these strategies?
Well, there's a symbiotic relationship between misplaced environmentalism and bureaucracy. They really feed on each other.
And money.
Well, sure. And we don't want to pretend that this is unique. I mean, we've seen these kinds of things throughout history, and it's human nature. And I don't want to sound too sanctimonious about it or too idealistic about it, because this is the way it is quite often. But you have the pendulum has to swing back. I mean, there has been eras where, with the State Water Project, for example, we built this remarkable system of water transfers in California that's still one of the best in the world. But we built that for a population that was half what it is today. And if we were going to do it over again, we'd do some things differently. But there are ways, such as the dredging and fish-friendly delta diversions. There's other technologies, new emerging technologies with desalination, that aren't nearly as disruptive to the environment, that could allow us to create water abundance cost effectively without hurting the environment. And we need the environmentalists and the bureaucrats to be reasonable, and in many cases just get out of the way.
Yeah, yeah. From your mouth upstairs. Let's talk about another issue that is related in terms of the environmental and bureaucratic forces that are blocking it. You testified before Congress in February this year, I believe, about the fires in Southern California in January, and just sort of this infrastructure of idiocy is what I would call it, I guess, that is built up in California that prevents us from doing smart forest management, obviously smart water management, water abundance, and protecting valuable property and lives from fires.
Yeah.
How do I ask this question succinctly, Edward? What are the two things we should be doing? You're king for a day. What are the two things we should be doing tomorrow to get our fire management going in the right direction in California?
Well, there's two areas. There's the forests, conifer forests, marketable timber, and then there's chaparral that typically surrounds big metropolitan areas, certainly like Los Angeles.
In the hills.
Yeah. And there's a nice segue here, because if we thinned our forests to historical normal densities, historically normal densities.
How far back would you go for historical normal density?
You wouldn't have to go that far, the 80s. What we did was we got better and better at fire suppression at the same time as we were logging, and the logging tended to compensate for the overgrowth that was occurring when we weren't allowing fires to burn naturally. But if you had normal tree density in the Sierra Nevada watershed, it would add 2 million acre feet to the amount of runoff that percolates into our springs and out into the streams and into the tributaries. So we would actually increase our water supply significantly, along with the fact that we would prevent all of these catastrophic wildfires. So we need to bring back the logging industry. And here again, we've learned a lot. We've learned, for example, that thoughtfully implemented clear cuts of 40 acres or less actually improve wildlife habitat. Believe it or not, I realize that's heresy, but wildlife biologists that actually work in the forest, as opposed to studying it from a biased professor somewhere, will testify to this, that species counts actually go up. You create meadow, which is habitat for deer and forage for deer. You create visually open areas where raptors and owls can see the rodents and can eat them. You create more opportunities for the predators like mountain lions, because the deer go out in the open and eat the forage. And you also, of course, create fire breaks. And then you can do thinning, selective logging elsewhere. You can avoid super sensitive areas, of course. But we shrunk our logging industry from 6 billion board feet a year as recently as the late 1980s to 1.25 billion board feet a year. In other words, it's 1/4 the size that it used to be. And so our forests have turned into tinder boxes.
And this has been in the name of environmentalism,
Yes,
conservation.
this was all the Endangered Species Act primarily. The California Environmental Quality Act is also used as a weapon by environmentalist litigators to basically destroy the logging industry in our state.
Yeah, these problems keep coming back to the same source, don't they?
Often.
You mentioned chaparral in the land that's
Yeah.
closer to urban centers.
That's right.
And what's the issue with clearing the chaparral and clearing, creating breaks and more safety in the areas that are closer to the dense urban populations?
Well, there's a lot of things that can be done there as well. It's a little bit more challenging because it's not as easy to do it commercially. You can just turn the timber industry loose and they'll take care of it and create jobs and pay taxes.
Right.
But you still need to. The Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, for example, needs to completely revisit all of their protocols because as it is, it's, and they work in conjunction with CARB, the California Air Resources Board. There's all kinds of obstacles to doing common sense things that we did 100 years ago. For example, the Santa Monica Mountains were grazed by goats and cattle, really, and sheep, right up until about 60 years ago, let's say. And that of course has a very a great benefit on how much fuel you've got up there because you've got all of these grazing animals that are eating the fuel. They also did controlled burns, and even historically, there are natural fires that are caused by lightning strikes, and these burns used to keep the chaparral thinned out. And that's something that's also been more or less, you suppress the fires that are started naturally, and then you prohibit the fires that we could do potentially. And you could do controlled burns in sort of a patchwork pattern. So you're not destroying the whole habitat. And you would be simply replicating what was occurring naturally for, millennia. You could also, you could just, grazing, thinning, and controlled burns. And it's very hard to do mechanical thinning as well on these hillsides. All of that has to be changed.
Why isn't the Santa Monica Conservancy doing these things?
Well, I'm not an expert on exactly why the Santa Monica Conservancy is not doing these things, but I think that there's just a lot of hardened opposition to anything that's going to disrupt the environment. If you're an owner of property and adjacent to your property is a thickly wooded or heavily overgrown canyon, that's a extreme fire danger. But then if you want to go in and thin it, you have to pay for studies. You have to verify that you're not going to disturb any habitat. It has to be exactly the right time of year because certain endangered species may have young that are present in that canyon at months out of the year. Controlled burns have to be, it's an ever shrinking window when you can actually risk a controlled burn.
Right.
So very risk averse, very litigious, a lot of rules, and all of that. We have to cut through that, and that's hard. Because there's strong emotional arguments and powerful legal obstacles to doing this work. But overall, I think it would actually benefit the environment.
Yeah, for sure. We certainly need to find a few key strategies that can give us a more sustainable, secure, predictable environment, right, for health and safety.
Well, in Los Angeles, they also have to, 50% of the fires are caused by homeless encampments in Los Angeles County.
50%.
That's the number that I heard from a firefighter.
50% of fires in LA County are caused by homeless encampments.
Wildfires. I think we could verify that number. And so,
insane.
helping the homeless has the side benefit of avoiding some of these catastrophic fires. We also have to underground the power lines, and that's an example of an infrastructure investment that perhaps would be worth prioritizing. Would make a big difference.
Well, allegedly it was for PG&E and others. I don't know where they are in their capex funding for it and their progress.
Well, it's a fool's errand. Try to go through neighborhoods where there's fire danger and they've sent the crews through. First of all, you get oak trees that are in this hideous remnant of what used to be a majestic oak with a normal crown, and now you've got them with a couple of branches sticking out horizontally, and there's the power lines going through it. It looks horrible. It's horrible for the tree.
Right.
And within a few years, it's going to grow back and you have to do it again. So you can't possibly
Yeah.
keep up with that.
Mhm.
And even doing it, there is downsides to doing it, even if you're reducing fire risk. So you really need to put those underground.
Yeah. We talk about energy.
Sure.
Water is obviously an energy source as well. We can come back to that. But you've written recently about Newsom and Democrats scaring oil and gas out of California, regulating refineries out of California, and now they want them to stay, but maybe it's too late. Why is Newsom scaring the refineries out of California, and what's going to be the knock-on effect?
Well, Newsom and the state legislature are committed to net zero by 2045. And they're, really going gangbusters to achieve that and breaking things along the way. And I think Newsom by now realizes that they went a little too far. When you get not one but two major refineries saying they're gonna leave town, and one of them is actually this is a bit of a scoop. They're gonna set up shop in Vietnam, and they're gonna get the heavy oil that we need for our refineries from one of the other major sources of heavy oil, which is Indonesia. And well, I'm speculating there, but Vietnam and Indonesia are pretty close. And then they're going to tank, and they're going to send refined gasoline, reformulated
Back to us.
California standards back to us. And that'll add at least 50 cents a gallon to the price.
So let's just run that back, Edward. This seems emblematic on a much larger scale of the knock-on effects of California climate policy. It's sort of the example of, well, we're going to grow tomatoes here, but we don't want to actually manufacture the ketchup because it causes carbon. So we're going to ship them to Nevada, ship the jobs out, the factory out, let them make the ketchup and send it back to us. So the carbon's emitted over a border that's a line in the desert. And this seems like the same thing on a much larger idiotic scale.
Well, you're right, and you just cited, or we have just discussed two examples of that. But there's a lot more examples than that. Of course, we get all of our solar panels from China. We get all the resources for our batteries from West Africa, for example. We get most of our wind turbines from Germany, and these kinds of things in the global warming or the Climate Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. They in their scoping plan. Wanted to prevent what they call leakage. And leakage is what you and I just talked about, all of these examples of where we export our environmental impact. And it's almost impossible to not export environmental impact. I didn't bring up biofuels, so let's not forget about them. We're having carbon credits and incentives for reformulated gasoline in California that are causing massive deforestation in the tropics, for example. And it's absolutely nuts.
Absolutely nuts. Let's say you're advising the next governor a year from November 2026. Well, let's say it's January 2027. New administration's in office. What would you advise them on, let's say, oil and gas energy policy? How do we get prices down? How do we attract industry back? What do we do?
Well, that's a big question, and it would, to some extent, depend on the state legislature. What emergency powers does the governor really have? I think that right away, and Newsom's probably already trying this, they need to keep the refineries here in California. They also need to drill again here in California. I think you could probably instruct CalGEM, the geologic, geologic energy management. It regulates all of the permits for drilling in California.
We're not giving any new permits, are we?
No.
Right, we stopped that. Newsom stopped
a
that.
couple of dozen last year.
Okay.
You're correct. It was a couple of dozen last year, and typically it's been in the thousands every year. And you have to do that. These oil fields, it's interesting, actually, when you study all the massive oil fields, for example, in Kern County, they can drill a well, and the well will produce, and then it'll produce at a lower rate, and then they'll go in and do some fracking, or they'll do some slant drilling, and they'll get a little bit more out of the well, but eventually the well isn't very productive. But the field still has tremendous reserves in it. So they have to continuously...
That are deeper?
Well, they're deeper, or they're just, adjacent. They're maybe a mile away. You put in another borehole and you get a productive well again. And it's kind of like, almond orchards and The walnut orchards, the trees might only last 20 or 30 years. All of our fruit orchards, they have to swap them out every 20 or 30 years. It's sort of the same thing with oil drilling. You have to drill new wells in order to keep the production up. California's oil reserves are estimated as high as 30 billion barrels. That's a big number, but the official number is 1.7 billion barrels. And the difference is because proven reserves have to be, if you don't have a reasonable prospect of being able to exploit a reserve, you have to write it off your books. It's for the SEC or something like that. So what they have are contingent reserves, which we don't even know, it's proprietary data, but it's many times 1.7 billion barrels. But that's all on the books of the people that own these wells, and that it's
Not
trade
official
secret.
numbers.
They're not official numbers. And then there's unproven or unrecoverable using current technology, but technology is advancing all the time. And California is a source of heavy oil. There aren't a lot of sources of heavy oil in the world. It's Venezuela, Indonesia, Canada has a lot of heavy oil. That's where we're getting most of it. But we designed our refineries to run on heavy oil and a mix of heavy and light oil. And if you don't have the heavy oil, you can't get diesel fuel, you can't get aviation fuel, you can't make asphalt. So you have to have both feedstocks to have a viable refinery. You can't just, and that's one of the fallacies that the environmentalists are perpetuating. They say, well, California's oil is the dirtiest oil. It's heavy oil. It has a higher sulfur content. Well, they're right about that.
Right.
But we can't make all of these products without the heavy oil. We can't run our refineries, and no one can without the heavy oil. So, you have to decide if we're not ready. We get half of our energy in California from petroleum, half.
Right.
If we're not ready to get rid of that half, we need to be doing it here where we can have much better safeguards, better labor standards, better environmental standards. Even if we were just reasonable with our environmental standards here, we'd still be better than anyone else in the world. So why are we exporting our production?
That's a very interesting point, which is the worker safety, compensation, and quality, those standards that we can actually implement here much higher, much better than the rest of the world, where we outsource all of these things, to potentially, veritable slave labor. I want to talk about one other important area, Edward, while we've got your brain, which is housing. You could argue that affordable housing and a average family being able to buy a home is really a foundation for economic success. It has been in American, history. Yeah. The equity that can be created in the home and just the feeling of solidity. Recent studies showed that only 16% of California families can afford a medium-priced home in California, which is now $950,000. Insanity. What are the top couple things we can do to increase the production of affordable housing in California?
Another big question. We have to make it possible for private, unsubsidized builders to build homes that, regular people can afford to buy.
Family.
Yeah, single family detached homes that families can afford to buy and want to live in.
Right.
A lot of the infill that's being prioritized by the state, the so-called infill, where we have urban service boundaries, right? And you can't develop outside of that area. So everything has to be infill. So everything's multifamily, everything's small lot. And you can never really create enough supply because we're already, this isn't generally understood. We are the most densely populated urban areas in the country because we developed late and we built all of these suburbs, but these suburbs are relatively dense.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have 94% of California's population living on 5% of the land, it's kind of preposterous to say we don't have any room to expand, because we do. You could put, I love this statistic, and this is just, basic arithmetic. It's 10 million people could move onto homes on quarter-acre lots, 4 per household. Mm-hmm. And then you take an equal amount of land for roads and parks and schools and industry and retail, everything.
Right.
You'd add about a little over 1% to that 5%. Right. So you'd be at 6.2%, let's say. It's less than 2,000 square miles in a state that's, 165,000 square miles. Mm-hmm. So it would be a negligible footprint to allow 10 million people to be living in, what is considered extremely low density nowadays. Quarter acre lot is a pretty nice lot,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the idea that we don't have room is crazy. But what we've done is, first of all, we've had urban containment. The other thing, of course, is the permits, the time it takes to get a permit, the fees, the number of agencies you have to go through adds, $100,000, $200,000 to the price of every home. It's ridiculous. So if you could fix those two things, you'd go a long ways. But you have to allow housing development on open land, and you have to build the energy and water infrastructure, which is what public investment used to prioritize, so that you have enough energy, enough electricity, enough utility hookups, enough water. You can't build a subdivision if you don't have water to feed the subdivision. So we have to invest in these enabling infrastructure, transportation as well, roads, power plants,
So
water supply.
A classic public-private partnership in terms of the government doing what it uniquely can do, and then private developers coming and actually building the housing stock and selling it to consumers.
And that used to work.
And it used to work. So CEQA, the dirty acronym. We know all about CEQA. For those who are watching who don't, the California Environmental Quality Act that has created just massive knock-on effects and a regulatory bureaucracy, here in Sacramento, and an army of lawyers making a huge amount of money suing based on CEQA, and interest groups, many of them very wealthy, saying we don't want to have anything built in my backyard or competes. So we know CEQA has been a disaster. What else needs to change, Edward, so that private developers have the incentives and there's a clear path for them to invest and create this housing stock?
Well, we talked about some of them. CEQA, in a perfect world, it would just be repealed, because there's plenty of other federal protections that are already, strong obstacles to development. There's other state things, the California Endangered Species Act, which is more stringent than the Federal Endangered Species Act. So we have federal protection, which, ought to be enough, and that it's not too much, because there are states that rely on the federal protections and don't have all these layers of additional protections that have affordable homes.
Right.
But we also probably should repeal the Global Warming Solutions Act, because everything that has spawned has increased the cost of living in California, not just for housing, but for everything. So that would be another thing to look at. Outlaw public sector unions. That would probably be the third thing that would be really big, because if you did that, you would destroy the symbiosis that we have with public sector union political power, and all of the leverage, all the legal bludgeons that the environmentalist movement have. You would pull so much of that off the table that I think you'd create an environment where, again, private sector builders could make a profit without subsidies, building homes, single family detached homes that normal working families can afford to buy. And we know it's possible. We've done it before.
Yes, those are all very strategic, very important. That last one, outlying public sector unions, that's probably a very tall metaphorical mountain right now. And,
well, some states have done it.
Some states have done it, yes. It's certainly been unions have every right to pursue their agendas, and in California, they've literally taken over the state. So we certainly need to change the game.
Well, the public sector unions have.
Public sector unions, yes.
And there's a strong argument for private sector unions, but I don't think most of those arguments don't apply to the public sector.
Incentives, there's a lot of moral hazard. So, Edward, I want to finish with rapid fire. 5 questions.
Okay.
There's no right or wrong. It's either the first thing that comes to your mind or a catchphrase. You ready?
Let's go.
Okay, you're king for a day. What's the first policy you implement to make California better?
Well, there's a tie. Repeal the Global Warming Solutions Act, or outlaw public sector unions.
Got it. Okay. What do outsiders misunderstand about our state?
Oh, it's still really great here. It's a great place.
I like it. I agree. Who's a past California leader, past or present California leader you admire?
I thought about that one, and I'm going to say John Muir. I think John Muir would be turning in his grave if he could see how out of common sense we've gone. And I'd like to put in a pitch for draining Hetch Hetchy. Let's get water for San Francisco with desalination, and let's restore that magnificent twin to Yosemite. which is the Hetch Hetchy Valley.
That is a name that's not come up yet, and it's a really good one because no one can argue against John Muir. Excellent. What gives you hope we can turn the state around?
I think people in California are waking up. I think they need to be presented with alternatives and solutions. But, California probably has the smartest people in, maybe in the whole world. And, they're not going to tolerate dysfunction forever. And there are answers. And so I think that, and I think it's bipartisan. I think that we're going to be on the right track again.
That's well said. Last one, fill in the blank. California is
a great place, and it's going to be even greater.
I like it. Edward Ring, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your time.